How's it going, everybody? My name's Will from Ghosthack, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my favorite vocoder of all time, VOCODEX. Now, VOCODEX is an advanced vocoder native to FL Studio, but before I explain VOCODEX, I should probably explain the history of a vocoder itself. Now, the first vocoder was invented in 1969 by a fellow named Chester vocoded. Now, the market for juicy and gurgly sound effects, I expect, was not very big back then, but he did find that if you talk through a box, a very interesting box, you could make your voice
kind of sound like this.
Now, I am, of course, kidding. The purpose of vocoding was actually a little more for radio purposes, but it was designed to resynthesize a voice based on the harmonic frequencies that were outputted by a voice, and you could run something else through it. This is still the basic concept of a vocoder today, and I'll show you kind of the practical uses of it, or impractical uses in my case. Aside from all the technical kind of details and the mumbo jumbo, I want to just get to its actual use in music production. So here I have a basic saw wave inside of Serum. Just doing that, it's a normal saw wave thing down low, and I can add a VOCODEX on it, and this is the first thing you will hear. And what you will see is all of these individual bands popping up right there, and that kind of goes back to the concept of what a vocoder is supposed to do. It wants to separate the thing that goes through it into frequency bands, and then it can analyze the volume of that frequency band coming into it. Then it can apply that volume and frequency to another sound running through it. So that's kind of the basis of what is going on here, and you can see we can adjust the bands here. This is at 47 bands. So there's 47 of these bands across the entire spectrum, and I can lower it, let's say down to like 20 or something like that, or maybe 30 in this case. And you can see the bands are thicker, there's a lower number of them, the sound itself has changed. We can go down to 20, there's an even lower number of them, and you can see as I bring these numbers down, the sound gets a little more flat and dry and has a little less character than if I were to bring it all the way to like 100. Now that's where you get a lot of the juicy frequencies. And right now what this is doing is kind of vocoding itself. It's vocoding the same sound instead of two sounds. But if I take just one sound vocoding itself, we have controls over these bands. For example, we can control the band width right here with this knob. You can see how the bands are separating out. And you can hear there's also resonance, because what it's doing is really narrowing in on specific frequencies. You can see down here in the EQ that it has all those frequencies narrowed down. And if we bring the number extremely low to something like 5, we get an even better look at that. Look at that, it sounds kind of froggy. And let's bring the width up. And we can see those bands really widening out and giving space for the frequency to come through. And that's we're kind of working with the accuracy of the vocoder at this point. We're deciding how accurately we want it to narrow into the frequencies, how thick we want the bands to be, and how many we want there to be. And those are very important controls because those drastically affect the sound. Here's the special thing though. One might say that once the bands are all touching together, once we bring them to about here, once we bring them so they look like they're all touching, those would be at 100% width. Well, actually they're not. We can extend the bands to overlap on top of each other, which also sounds very interesting. All we have to do is bring this knob up a little more. And there's bands on top of bands on top of bands, you know, bringing through the same frequencies. And what this does is that can kind of create some phase cancellation. You can get some different tonalities through the vocoder. And I love to do this with, say, like dubstep, heavy growl basses, or maybe drum and bass like neuro basses. It can make them sound very juicy, especially if the band width is very high with a low number of bands, because you'll have a bunch coming through at once. It makes it sound very rich. And there's another important knob here called the band width multiplier. And what you can do with this is basically control the contrast of the frequencies as far as volume goes. This is kind of controlling the dynamics of each of the frequencies. For example, if we have it all the way down like this, then what you will find is that the low frequencies are nice and high, and then these frequencies kind of plateau about right here. But if we bring up this contrast here, we can see that all the frequencies are generally in the same realm. And then if we bring it down, you can see that the differences are kind of maximized. there. So this is basically controlling the different dynamics of these frequencies together to kind of make them either about the same or they can have more of a curve to them. And this comes in extremely handy when you're vocoding vocals. I'll show you how to do that in a minute, but there's one more knob I want to go over before I really go into the, the typical use of a vocoder. And it's this knob right here, the modular pitch shift. Now on a saw wave like this, it probably doesn't sound like much, but if we do something and make this saw wave kind of talk a little bit and make it almost like a bass, like if we wanted to say something, maybe with a band reject, we can make it have like a yai sort of tonality. See, not the cutoff, I want this to go on the bandwidth. We've kind of created this vowel sound, and a lot of the low frequencies are being very annoying down here, so I'm actually going to use this band gain multiplier right here to bring down the low frequencies. And this is actually a spectrum view of how hard the bands are going into the vocoder. But now you can hear we have a vowel sound going through the vocoder, and we can control kind of the formant of this with this modular pitch shift. It can make the sound kind of higher, a little brighter, or it can make it a little darker. And you will especially be able to hear that when we use a vocal. And that's the next thing I want to do. I want to actually run a vocal through a vocoder because this is one of the more popular uses of vocoders. And the concept of this actually is used in a lot of things, especially FM synthesis, having a carrier and a modulator. What this means is essentially you have one sound, the carrier, that is basically outputting the stuff to work with, the sound to actually work with. For example, this saw wave, that would be the carrier. Right? That's actually the one making the sound. Then you have a modulator, which is something different. And what we're doing with the modulator is the vocoder is just going to track the motion of the modulator. And it's going to apply that motion to the carrier. So I can make this saw wave sound like it's actually speaking something like a vocal if I use a vocal as the modulator. And I'll show you how to do this. First of all, we're going to take off this weird filter on Serum so we just have a saw wave again. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take any vocal. For example, let me take this vocal from Ghosthack's Ultimate Vocal Library 2.
How do you feel?
And I'll run that through the vocoder as the modulator, and then the saw wave can carry it. So let's take this and throw this right here, and then we can take the saw wave and throw that right there. You can see that we want to make the saw wave a little bit longer. And so we end up having the vocal going through channel 2 and the saw wave going through channel 1 with the vocoder.
How do you feel?
And what we want to do is we want to take channel 2, which the vocal is running through. We want to right click, hit sidechain to this track only, right? And now it is being unrouted from the master. So we can't hear it at all, and it's just side chaining right to 1. So it's sending its signal to 1 without any output. And VOCODEX can pick up on this. All we have to do is make sure that this is on 1 right here, this channel right here. And now we can listen to how the vocal would sound with the saw wave on it, or how the saw wave would sound if it was saying the vocal. And now it's not a very good patch right now. We're going to have to edit these settings, but this is basically what it does. You can order these bands in different ways.
How do you feel?
Now you can hear that the saw wave is literally singing the vocal because we put the vocal over the saw wave with this vocoder. So now it's just a matter of tampering with the settings and trying to find the best one to work with this vocal.
How do you feel? How do you feel?
As you can hear, by changing this order around, we can control the depth of the effect that the vocoder actually has.
How do you feel? How do you feel? How do you feel?
Turning the bandwidth up makes it a little bit muddy and messy.
How do you feel?
And you can see there are some frequencies here that are coming through a lot more than the others. So what we can do is kind of take these down.
How do you feel?
Don't be afraid to just make little spots that you think need them.
How do you feel? How do you feel? How do you feel?
And maybe we won't use just a normal saw wave. Maybe let's add some detune.
How do you feel?
We could almost play like a lead with this right here.
How do you feel?
And that's the beauty of this vocoder, so that we are not limited to what we can do with Serum. We can do anything we want. It doesn't even have to be Serum. It can be anything that we want, any kind of plugin. It could be another sample. Actually, from doing that, it sounds even cooler lower down, but we can adjust this tempo. And now here's a great example of this modular pitch shift involved. And you can tell when we turn the knob up, it gets kind of chipmunky and high frequency, because that's changing the actual pitch of the modulator, which is the vocal. That's the modulator pitch shift. And then if you turn it down, it gets all deep and kind of monstrous and cartoony, which is also very good for basses and things like this. But especially when you move this around, it has a very dramatic effect.
How do you feel? How do you feel?
And you can see what we've created here is something really dark and kind of ominous. And we've created it just by running the vocal through this and messing with all of these things and trying to figure out what works best. Obviously, if I wanted to sound more watery, I could turn the order up and, bring more of that vocoder action in.
How do you feel?
And then, of course, 1 is kind of a lot drier.
How do you feel?
Just however you want, but we can make something a little more lighthearted as well. If I put some saucy saw chord stacks on there.
How do you feel? How do you feel?
It has a completely different vibe, but we got to go in and of course change the settings to kind of fit this. So I can bring the modular pitch shift back up.
How do you feel?
And I can adjust this bandwidth.
How do you feel? How do you feel?
And maybe I can control the bandwidth multiplier as well. Again, this is kind of what I like to call the contrast knob. There's less dynamics up here, more dynamics down here.
How do you feel? How do you feel?
Next thing I want to do is control the actual number of bands itself.
How do you feel? How do you feel? How do you feel?
And just by that, you can clearly tell that the lower amount that the bands are, the lower number that we make the bands, the less clearly the vocal can actually be heard. Because if we lower it to, say, 16 bands like this, there's only 16 bands of volume that the vocoder can really analyze. If we make it 100 bands, now we're splitting that into a lot more bands that it can recognize, and it can detect the actual speech that's coming out of this voice a lot easier. And of course, that makes it easier to apply to the sound that we have, in this case, chord stacks.
How do you feel?
So I'm definitely going to bring up this number.
How do you feel? How do you feel?
And one more trick for these vocals that is really interesting is adding kind of this chorus option that you see in VOCODEX here. That's going to cause more voices of the sound to kind of run through the vocoder as the modulator. And it's going to kind of pitch shift these around. It's like a unison, and it can create a really interesting effect. So let's turn this all the way up to 5.
How do you feel?
And let's add more of this unison kind of pitch shifting.
How do you feel? How do you feel? How do you feel?
You can even see in the analyzer that there's more stuff going on. Like,
how do you feel?
You can see those few peaks, and you can see that these peaks are multiplied when we do this.
How do you feel?
So this works really well if you're layering these vocals that you vocoded onto, say, like a clean vocal. And speaking of doing that, a very efficient way to do that may be to go right here, maybe turn down this, turn down the vocoded part itself. Then we can take the clean vocal and route this through the master. Just hit route to this track.
How do you feel?
Of course, now we can hear the original pitch, so the pitch would have to be identified. Then you'd have to key your chords to the same pitch. Let me do that real quick. So now I figured out the vocal's pitch, and I threw some chords over them that will kind of match them both in major and minor, and you can hear how this affects the sound of the vocal itself.
How do you feel? How do you feel?
And then all you'd want to do is just add like the, reverb and your other effects on both of those and mix them together to create that layer. Now, I know I've not gone over everything in this video. There's still a lot about VOCODEX that was left uncovered, although a lot of other people have covered it in many other videos on YouTube. What I wanted to show you is some of the most important parts of VOCODEX for me, some of the most utilitarian parts for the kind of music that I do. Usually, I'm either throwing VOCODEX on a really nasty growl bass to try to make it gritty and bubbly and really dirty and, add add a more vocal effect, or I'm going to use it alongside a vocal or another sound, running two sounds together to, use the typical carrier and modulator setup the same way that FM synthesis works, which I've also showed here. Now, VOCODEX is a very complex plugin, as many vocoders are, and it's not very easy to understand right off the bat. I encourage you, if you're trying to go in and mess with it, if you don't get beautiful results right off the bat, I encourage you to still, go through the controls, look at the kind of stuff that it does, and just listen to the kind of sounds that you can create, because there's so much sound design to be done here that I can never get bored of it. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.